Well, friends, it is time for me to interview an incredibly talented writer and author, Dorothy Robey, who just recently published her debut novel, Passage of Promise. We will be discussing the exciting news and all the other writing projects Dorothy is working on right now. And then again, like we mentioned, later in the show, we'll be talking to Michael Kearney about his recently published book of poetry. So stick around. And but first, we're going to talk to Dorothy. Hi, Dorothy.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Welcome.
Okay, good. Hi, thanks.
I'm sorry
thanks
you had problems,
me.
with the calling in.
I'm just glad it worked. I, want to make sure. So.
Right. Well, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing okay. Taking it easy.
Good. So I know you've been busy with a lot of writing projects. Is that something that's kept your mind off all this chaotic time that we're going through?
Yeah, at times it's a nice escape for sure. It's been really crazy. So
Right.
I've had time for that, and then I've had time to just rest and take breaks. So that's a good thing.
Oh, okay. Well, that's awesome. Hey, it's been about a year since we last chatted on the show, and I do want to thank you again for being a guest, again on the show. I look forward to discussing, all that's been happening with you, especially the exciting news about your recently published novel, Passage of Promise. It was a privilege. You're welcome. And it was a privilege to read it. I just loved it. I felt like I was part of the story, one of the characters watching the other characters because, you're just incredibly talented at scene and character descriptions. It just felt like I was there,
Oh,
so
cool. That's
really,
great.
Yeah, it was a wonderful story, of faith and love. And, again, I just loved it. But now,
well,
when you were on the show, yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. And when you were on the show last, you shared your history as a writer going back to the age of 12 when you wrote your first short story on your father's electric typewriter. What I'd like to do is revisit your journey from that 12-year-old girl to now being a published author. But first, I thought we should talk about your novel. So it's Passage of Promise. Now, how exciting that must be to get published.
Yes, it was a long, long road to that. 5-year project of writing it, and then the rest of the time just revisions, as you know, and then some writing of other stories in between, and then going back to it, and the professional editing, and then going back to it the next year, and fixing more revisions, and then going through another edit. But I feel like when you work really hard at something, it does make a difference. It does. You do see the fruits of your labor, as they say. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that was one of the things I was going to ask you, about the steps that you had to go through, to make it to being published. And I know it's a lot of work. Like you said, 5 years for you. That definitely sounds like it was a labor of love that you kept at, with it, and then finally now you are published, so that's excellent. Can you give us a description of what your novel is about?
Yes, it's basically about a woman, her family, and she has had a lot of bad luck with all kinds of relationships, including relationships with her mother and her sister, and then relationships with her boyfriends and dates. And so she didn't really have a high self-esteem. Her mother was very controlling. And so a terrible thing happened with her nephew, that he got a serious illness, a life-threatening one. And so her mother sent her to Santorini to retrieve her great-grandmother's wonder-working icon. So in their tradition, God works through material holy objects. And so she wasn't totally on board with that, but, she didn't really have a choice. So she went.
Right.
And I think for her, it was a kind of an escape from the situation that she was in at home. So she found kind of a time to breathe there than if she would have stayed and had to face her nephew's illness, which was hard for her to look at and to deal with at that time. So.
Right. Well, what inspired you to write that story? Was there anything in your personal life or someone that you've known that went through maybe something similar to an illness or something like that? Or
yes. Anytime I write anything, I do have some kind of now not all of my stories, but in a few of my stories, it helps to have the experiences to use because it makes your story more realistic and more believable. The characters are, of course, all fiction. But, I think what's interesting about this story is when I started to write it, I had a tendency when I just started writing again in 2014, and it was really hard at first because it had been almost 18 years, it was like 17 years or so, since I'd actually really written anything. I wrote a short children's story first, kind of just started that, and then I went into this story. And the way I started this story was basically just stream of consciousness. So I didn't really have any idea what I was going to do with this story at the beginning. And it didn't start the way it does now, because early on you're going to have so many different ways you've done your story, and then you end up having to change and all that. But it did. It started out as a stream of consciousness, and then I saw a scene, and then I just wrote it, and then it just seemed to pick up from there, and I just kept writing. And by the time I got to probably about a quarter into it and almost to half, I thought to myself, well, I really need to figure out what direction this is going. And then, I was kind of a pantser, as they say, and you just go by whatever comes out of your pen. But at the same time, I started to realize, okay, I need to have some kind of plot, some kind of what does my character want? All of the things that I was learning in my college classes, but I hadn't tied it together at that time because I had just started college. So I was learning all of this. So it took that much time to totally transform it into what it needed to be a story and to have the character arc and the plot. And I do have subplots, obviously, in that story. What's so interesting to me is, kind of off topic, is that the readers all got something different out of the story, depending on what part that they liked, what subplot or whatever that they related to the most. So the medical portion of the story was experience. So I was able to use that in a believable way because my youngest son, went through a serious illness. So I used that as part of my storyline, and then, of course, the faith thing just came automatically with it once I tied that together. The romance came kind of in between, probably halfway through. The romance kind of grew as a side, and it just, you kind of write and your characters take you certain ways. And so I was kind of following where she was taking me and her experiences and how she would be in relation with other characters and other people in her life. And so that's how it came to that point.
Well, I understand what you're saying. The characters sometimes just take over the story, and you're just like someone just jotting down the notes, while they're really telling the story to you. Yeah. Yes. Well, I know that your writing is mostly faith-based, and just like this novel. And but please tell us a little bit more about how important that is to you in your writing.
I think it's just a natural part of me because it's my life. So it just it will just naturally come out in any type of way in any of my stories. Now, there are some short stories I don't have any overt or real indication of my faith. But my other two stories that I wrote, there is the faith in there. But I think I would have to say that Passage is probably the most overt out of what I've written. It's showing my faith because of the fact that there is the icon and there's the mirror, wanting a miracle, wanting to believe and all that. It was a lot more overt in this book than in my other two. So it just depends on what my characters are doing. I know that sounds weird, but
no, I understand.
So what you didn't know was a lot more edgy, and it's a drama, and it's a women's fiction story about relationships, and it's just more that way, a little more edgy and meaty in that instance. But there is a portion of my faith in that as well. But there's three sisters, and so there's three different stories going on in that book. So it's only in the one. So
right,
it's a mixture.
Right. Well, I loved all the subplots too. I mean, it was very interesting to read everything, and it held my attention to the end. I mean, I was reading the chapters. I used to I started off, and I think I mentioned it to you before, as I started off just reading at night, but then I was getting so, interested in what's going to happen that I just sat down and I said, I'm going to finish this. I want to read it. I want to know where it's going. So, yeah. Well, let me ask you, I know you mentioned steps that you had to do, like the editing and different things like that, but you mentioned before, I think it was the last time you were on the show, that you have critique group that you run your chapters through.
Yes.
And you're writing through. How does that work? How does that work, being part of that group? Well,
it's an online site, so you just go in there and you sign up, and it's free. You can sign up free, or you can start as a regular member, but you can also go up to maybe a premium, and then there's the gold member, and you get certain perks, obviously, when you pay, and you go higher up on what you can do with your submissions while it's in the queue, waiting to come up, or even when it's up. So you submit your chapters, and then you pick what forum you want what genre form that your book would fit in. And then people just, if they're interested and they find your story interesting, then of course they'll, because I critique too, so I will read and be thinking, okay, well, do I want to read this story? Do I want to read that? And then if they catch my interest, then I just read it and then, give some feedback. And you can do a classic type of feedback, which is basically a critique where you would just write 300 words or so, because you get credit. So if you write 300 or more words, you get a credit, and you have to have so many credits to submit your work. So your chapter or whatever, you have to have so many credits to do that. And so it's a nice tip for CAT, so that each person who does that, then they get a return favor and things like that. So it's a really, really good place. So.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. I mean, that's so helpful. I know I was a part of a writing group one time, and that's what we did. We shared our work and then critiqued it, and then we ended up actually taking a lot of our short stories and creating an anthology and publishing several of our short stories. So that was pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, and then I know it's hard sometimes to find the right editor and the right publisher. How did that process work for you?
Oh, that's a great question. It's very interesting because that really is. That's a great question. I am a member. I signed up several, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, in a women's books Facebook group. And there was I don't know what the number is now. I think they're somewhere around 15,000 to 16,000 women in there, and they support each other, and they have their books, and so people ask questions from there, advice on what to do about their finding the editor, or how do you do this in historical fiction, or whatever the genre is. They ask questions and things about marketing, whatever it is, and you learn a lot through their questions and people's answers. And that's how I started. I thought, okay, so this is what they're doing. And while I was in there, I can't remember exactly how it happened, but it was somebody had posted something about their work, and then I had said I had just done my play, Falling Upstairs, for my class.
Oh, right, yeah.
And so then, I found out I was able to put it on the small stage, and so, which was really fun. But I mean,
I loved it. It was so funny.
Thank you. And that whole thing was a stream of consciousness. I literally just wrote that out. So that was kind of neat that it just came out, because my assignment when I had to do that, it was in creative writing. I'd never done, it was originally a screenplay. I had never done one. So, I was thought, well, gee, I don't, I got the template of how you're supposed to do that, how you're supposed to write out the script. But I couldn't think of anything to write, for this. I don't know what to say. What am I going to say? I mean, I'm like, I don't want to do a romance. I mean, I felt like it was kind of like old and cliche. I thought, I don't want to do that. It's always the same thing. I want to do something different. And I just couldn't come up with anything. So I just sat down, and I used to always write with a pencil and notebook. And so I just thought, okay, I'll just start writing. And that's what came out of my brain, falling upstairs.
You just never know, right? What's going to come up?
So while I put that in that thread, then my editor, she became my editor. She said, that's really awesome. I did plays too. And then it turned out that she had done, I can't remember exactly, over 20 plays in California. And so she had really, really good stuff. I mean, she has a master's degree. She has all this. She's known for these, she's done all this. And I thought, wow, I'm going to check her out. Well, what happened is somehow after that, we were discussing the play thing. We went to private message, and I was asking, I was telling her I was frustrated because I was working on my blog, and I didn't know how to do all the things that you need to do to customize it and to design it. And I was working really hard. I'm not this real tech-savvy person. I just know the basics. And so she helped me to fix up by, PMing with me. And she helped me to get my blog to the way I wanted it to look and how I wanted it to work. And so that was how it first started. And then I told her that I had some work. And I had originally gone to somebody else for a sample chapter of my book passage. But then I was talking to my editor, Annie, and she was like, oh, well, I do editing, and I do free samples. Because I asked her, I was like, by the way, do you do free samples? Because we seem to click, we seem to, because you kind of have to have that if you're going to be working with somebody. So I said, okay.
Sure.
And I asked her, and she said she did. And so I sent her 2 chapters that she freely did the edit for me, and then sent it back to me. And I was impressed, and she liked it, what she read, and then from then on we decided, when I was ready, I was going to send it to her, and then from then on, that's what we did. We've been doing.
Yeah, right. Well, that's great. I mean, it's wonderful when you can find the right editor and the right publisher, too. Sometimes that's really hard to do. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, we should let everyone know how they can get a copy of your novel, Passage of Promise. I know that it's on Amazon, the paper book, and also the Kindle. And and then you're also on Barnes & Noble and globally. So that's amazing. And,
so, and also on IndieBound.
Yeah.
If you're into supporting independent booksellers, my paperback is available on IndieBound's online site. So.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, excellent. And I just really think it was wonderful to talk about your novel. Was there anything else you wanted to tell us about the novel before we move on to any other topic for you? Well, one thing I wanted to...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I'm really pleased by people's responses to reading my book. It makes my day. It really, I don't really know how to say it, but it just fills me with such joy and to see people moved by my characters. That's my main thing that I try to do, is to invest the reader into the lives of my characters so much that they feel they can relate and they can feel what they're feeling. I like to write books I like to write what I like to read. So if I like to read a book, I like to be able to laugh at times and I like to be able to cry at times. Because if it can make me do both of those things, I know that it's written well. That's my view. So
I believe that too. I do
that.
believe that too. Yeah.
Right,
yeah,
right. So I did have that with this novel, and I really appreciated those responses. It was like what I wrote, it came through. So
yeah,
that's a big deal to me.
Yeah, and you've been getting a lot of great reviews online. I've read them on Amazon. It's just amazing.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yes.
Well, everyone be sure to get a copy. It's a great read. And, yeah, absolutely. Well, when you were on the show before, we talked about your journey, from being that 12-year-old girl writing her first short story. And then I know the last time we talked, you were in the process of publishing your novel. But I thought it might be great to just revisit that journey for the new listeners and talk about all the other work that you've done. Would that be all right?
Sure.
Oh, okay, great. Well, I know that when you were 12, you wrote your first short story. And then when you were a teenager, you wrote several other short stories, including a trilogy of family set in the Civil War area. How did that come up?
Yes. Well, what's so ironic about my story is that I did not grow up reading books. And almost everybody I know who's a fellow writer was a voracious reader. So I was kind of thinking to myself, wow, this does not fit my story, that everybody else seems to have that story. But for me, I had some comprehension problems through grade school into junior high. I had to do like special classes and things like that. So reading was very difficult. I would sit down with my dad around 4th, 5th grade, and he would sit there with me for an hour reading things like Treasure Island, the big books. And I mean, it was agonizing trying to read those because I had such a hard time. But, he would work with me, and my dad always had a lot of patience. And so, but I always had a huge imagination. So I was always dreaming of things when I was growing up. And I did watch, and I think because I'm a visual person, TV worked for me to kind of prompt some ideas, especially, so the first one I wrote, that was probably just TV shows, or perhaps, I did read Judy Blume's book, Tales of 4th Grade and Nothing. So in 4th grade I read that, because she was reading it to us, but, we would read portions. and I thought that was funny, so I was able to get through that. But the first one, I actually remember what it was called. I had typed it up on my father's typewriter. What was so funny is that I actually cut the paper. I used actual 8x11, notebook paper, and I typed it up by chopping it in half and just using like the one side of it, and then I typed on that, and then I type on the next one and the next one. I don't know why I did that, but I ended up with this big fat, book because I was using these smaller pieces. So maybe I was trying to make it look like a real book. It would probably be something I would have done. It looks like a real book if I make it this size. So I did it. It was called A Stuffed House, which is kind of funny. It was just this family with all these kids. And I had a friend that she was one of 4 kids, and she was one of my good friends at the time. And so I probably got some ideas from that. But the trilogy, the trilogy was all because of a miniseries I watched. I was, in fact, thanks to John Jakes, if you know who he is, he wrote North and South. So I watched that whole miniseries when I was in high school on my little tiny 9-inch black and white radio TV. So it's kind of funny.
Oh, wow.
I did. Yeah, and you forget that there's no colors because you get used to it, but I did. I watched that whole miniseries on that, and I was so into that, really into that. In fact, I still have it, the DVDs, the whole set of those. But he prompted me to read North and South, and then I read all of his Kent Family Chronicles, so it was thanks to him that I got into reading. But I was so into that I actually wrote that trilogy about family during the Civil War time. So that was, and then of course I was reading everything Civil War after that. You know, what happened here? I was reading all those things to get an idea of that. But yeah, it was fun.
Yeah,
it was fun.
Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful, and having a great imagination and being able to do something with it, putting it in words and writing, I think that's just wonderful.
Yes.
Well, now you said you took an 18-year hiatus from writing until September, I think, of 2014. That's when you started to write again.
Yeah, it was like about 17 years because after I got married and then my husband went off to Korea for a year, and then we moved, and then I had children, and so everything became, obviously about that. And for some reason, I think maybe it's just because when you're so busy, you don't have time to think about writing. Now, there were a few times that I had some ideas that had never made it to paper. So it wasn't until close to the time that I went back to school that started to come about. So it was very strange to write again after all that time. I was in my 20s, I did write a novel called Inseparable, but it needs some work, obviously, because I knew how to write, but I didn't have all the actual understanding of how the story works with the arcs and the plot and the point of view. All that stuff you have to learn, so you kind of know how to structure your book. But I was part of the I was part of the Rocky Mountain Writers Guild then in Denver. So like you said, you had your writers group. I did too. In my early to mid 20s, I would drive up to Boulder and meet up with a group of people, and we would, exchange our chapter, and that was fun. So that was my first experience of doing critiquing and, actually immersing myself in something along the workshop and writing groups thing. So that was kind of neat. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Well, I know that you write, different genres sometime in your writing. It's varied because you have written 2 children's short stories and an inspirational novel, a humorous nature environmental short story, a mainstream short story, and 2 lighthearted plays. So you've been writing a lot of different things. And what inspires you? Like you said, it's just the conscious first, right? And then you just start writing. Is that how your writing process is?
Well, it was interesting. I wrote a blog post on that a few weeks back that I had changed how I come about writing anything. It used to be that I was a pantser, stream of conscious, whatever came. But my next novella that I wrote after Passage, I actually wrote notes. So I don't do outlines, because some people do outlines or they do notes. I do notes, and I just write characters that come to my mind, their names, and then I try to figure out what their personality is, what they're about, and then I have the plot. I have to have ideas of that. I was listening to a writing coach who, by the way, was one of my ARC readers, and she just did a wonderful thing in there. She's also left an Amazon review that was really just amazing. And she said, if you really don't know how your book is going to end, you probably won't finish the book. And I think that's pretty true. So,
yeah, I never thought about that, but that does sound true, yes.
Yes, so I wrote out a basic shell of what I wanted to do with Mourning Dove. And I wrote that was shorter, so I think I finished that in about 2-3 months, the first draft. And so since then, I finished that in 2017. And so since then, I've run it through my critique group. Now it's been twice. So I ran it through recently this last go-around. And it's getting closer and closer to being done. So it's kind of a race to see which one goes first, if it's going to be What She Didn't Know or if it's going to be Mourning Dove. Whatever is done first, whatever works first, I'll put out next, which would probably be like next spring or summer.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll definitely need to have you back on the show to discuss those when they do come out. That'd be awesome. Yeah, well, I did want to let everyone know that there is a couple of ways that they can follow you. Like you mentioned, you have your blog, and that is .dot loves, LUVS, the number 2, write. So it's Dove Loves to Write, which sounds perfect. .com. And then they also can follow you on your Facebook author page, Dorothy Robey, and that's spelled Robey. And, well, I just wanted to say thank you, for being on the show again and letting me interview you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I really appreciate you, and you have such fabulous questions.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to find out as much as I can. Well, friends, I just want to say don't forget to get a copy of Dorothy's novel, Passage of Promise, available again on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and globally. And you are going to just love reading it. And do not forget to give her a great review. Thanks again, Dorothy, for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. And you're welcome.
Okay. Well, we'll talk to you again hopefully soon when you are published again. And I will let you go for tonight.